May 1945. The war in Europe is over, but for the women behind the barbed wire, silence feels heavier than victory. Evening settles over the American-run POW camp near Rheims, France. The air smells of damp earth and burnt wood from a nearby field kitchen. Rows of exhausted German women sit on makeshift benches, wrapped in thin gray blankets, staring into nothing. Some were clerks, others nurses or signal auxiliaries, all now prisoners of a war that ended days ago. From beyond the fence, faint music drifts through the dusk. A trumpet, then a soft drum beat. The rhythm feels alive, foreign, almost forbidden. It grows louder, swinging and unpredictable. The sound of jazz. A few women lift their heads. They had heard this rhythm once in secret years ago, before it was branded degenerate by the Reich. Now, in defeat, it fills the air freely. One woman covers her face, shoulders shaking. Another lets out a half-laugh, half-sob. That night, as the American soldiers played Duke Ellington on a battered phonograph, something cracked. Not the fences, but the silence between enemies. In the spring of 1945, Europe was a continent of ruins. The once proud cities of the Third Reich, Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, lay flattened beneath seas of rubble. The Reich itself had collapsed like a hollow shell. Adolf Hitler was dead, his armies shattered, and the Nazi flag that had once flown from the Atlantic coast to the Volga now burned in the streets. What remained of Germany's armed forces was surrendering in millions, not in triumph, but in quiet exhaustion. Among them were not only men. Tens of thousands of women had served the regime in supporting roles. They were nurses, clerks, radio operators, translators, and anti-aircraft auxiliaries known as Flakhelferinnen. For years they had worked in the shadow of the front, manning searchlights, operating rangefinders, and serving in military hospitals overwhelmed by the dying. They were not combatants, yet they were still soldiers of a collapsing empire, bound to its fate. When Germany surrendered, many of these women found themselves captured by Allied troops. Americans, British, Canadians, and Soviets, who were advancing from every direction. The surrender created one of the largest movements of prisoners in history. Camps sprang up overnight across France, Belgium, and Germany. Barracks were converted from Luftwaffe depots, fields turned into tent cities, and entire towns ringed with barbed wire to hold the flood of defeated soldiers. The United States Army suddenly found itself responsible for over 3 million German prisoners, including several thousand women. Most had been captured in the West, where the Americans treated prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. But confusion reigned. In the chaotic weeks following the armistice, POWs were transported in open trucks, sometimes marching for days under rain and hunger before reaching temporary enclosures. At first, the American guards didn't know what to do with female prisoners. They were an anomaly in a war that had been imagined as men against men. Many of the women were barely out of their teens. Some had volunteered out of patriotism. Others had been conscripted in the desperate final months of the Reich. Their uniforms carried the insignia of service, but not of power. In the camps, they were segregated from male prisoners and placed under the supervision of U.S. military police. The Americans, many of them young and weary themselves, looked at these captured women with a mixture of suspicion and disbelief. Propaganda had painted Germans as ruthless automatons, fanatical servants of Hitler. Yet here were women who looked tired, frightened, and utterly human. Food was scarce, and rations were simple: bread, soup, sometimes canned meat. Yet for many of the German prisoners, it was the first time in months they had eaten regularly. The Red Cross worked alongside U.S. forces to distribute supplies, though shortages persisted across the continent. Inside the barbed wire, time slowed. Days blurred into one another. Roll calls, chores, brief interrogations. The women wrote home on official camp stationery, though mail often took months to arrive. Many were haunted by rumors of what awaited those captured by the Soviets: forced labor, retribution, disappearance. By comparison, American captivity began to feel like an improbable mercy. But it was not kindness alone that would leave its mark. It was something deeper: culture. For the first time in years, these women were surrounded not by slogans and marches, but by fragments of another world. American soldiers hummed as they worked. They played cards, joked, and shared cigarettes. In the distance, one might hear laughter, a harmonica, or even a phonograph. To women raised under the cold discipline of Nazi order, this informal, almost careless humanity was disorienting. The Reich had taught obedience and silence. America seemed built on noise and motion. Still, beneath exhaustion and guilt, curiosity began to stir. Who were these men who fought without hatred, who offered coffee and conversation to their former enemies? Why did they carry radios that played music banned in Germany for being too free, too wild? That question would soon find its answer one evening in a camp not far from Rheims, when the air carried a rhythm unlike anything they had been allowed to hear in years. The camp near Rheims was one of many American-run facilities established in liberated France after the German surrender. Rows of tents stretched across open farmland, encircled by coiled wire and wooden guard towers. The infrastructure was temporary, improvised, built not for punishment, but for containment. Yet within those makeshift fences, a strange and quiet new world was forming. Every morning the prisoners were counted at dawn. The American guards called out numbers instead of names, the sound echoing through the chill air. The women lined up in gray wool coats, their hair tied beneath scarves, boots coated with mud. There was no shouting, no beatings, no deliberate cruelty. Just a rigid routine designed to maintain order among thousands. For many of the women, that restraint itself felt unreal. They had been raised to expect vengeance. Rumors had reached them about Soviet camps in the East. Starvation, violence, disappearances. Compared to that, the Americans seemed almost indifferent. They gave orders without hatred, enforcing rules but rarely humiliation. When fights broke out between prisoners, U.S. guards often separated them with little more than a warning. "No more trouble," they would say, and walk away. It was a kind of discipline that came not from ideology, but from fatigue and professionalism. Meals were simple, distributed through long queues. Bread that was coarse but plentiful, watery soup, sometimes beans or meat from army rations. For those who had lived through the starvation of the final war months, it felt like abundance. Cigarettes, chocolate, and instant coffee occasionally appeared. Small treasures passed from soldier to prisoner in quiet gestures that said more than words. But beneath the routines, tension remained. Many of the women had grown up under Nazi propaganda that portrayed Americans as chaotic, immoral, and crude. They had been told to expect degradation, perhaps even death. Yet what they found was a culture that seemed almost alien in its openness. Guards laughed freely, called each other by nicknames, and played cards during breaks. Some had photographs of their families clipped to their helmets, smiling wives, children, even dogs. That human familiarity was perhaps the most shocking thing of all. Under the Reich, emotion had been masked behind uniformity and control. Here the Americans displayed it without fear. They argued, joked, even sang. Their music drifted through the camp like an invisible rebellion against the silence of defeat. The source of that music was often a portable phonograph, a metal box with a crank handle and a needle that scratched across black shellac records. The Americans treated it like gold, gathering around it after duty hours. To the German prisoners, the sounds that emerged were unlike anything they had heard since before the war. Brass horns, drums, improvisation, rhythm. It was not the rigid marches or operatic anthems of home. It was movement itself. The first time one of the women recognized it, faint but unmistakable, she froze. Jazz. In Germany, it had been forbidden, mocked as Neger music, banned from radios and public halls. The Gestapo had raided underground clubs in Berlin where young people secretly danced to it, calling themselves swing kids. Many of those youths had vanished into camps. Now, here it was. Not in secret, but openly, played by their former enemies. The irony was painful and profound. The music their government had condemned as degenerate was the same music that now filled the air above their barbed wire world. As the days passed, curiosity turned to fascination. The rhythms were unpredictable, alive, a language without words that spoke of something they couldn't name. Some guards explained that it was Duke Ellington, Benny Goodman, or Glenn Miller, names unknown to most Germans raised under censorship. The women listened from afar, pretending indifference but unable to hide the pull of sound. Inside the camp, conversations began to shift. The women, once silent and withdrawn, began to talk about home, about their families, about what had gone wrong. The Americans, many just boys from Ohio or Texas, listened. Some traded a few German words for a cup of coffee or a story about life in Frankfurt or Cologne. There were no speeches, no declarations of peace. But through that strange coexistence, guarded yet human, the lines between victor and vanquished began to blur. Music, laughter, and shared weariness became their new language. And then, one evening, the distance between them vanished entirely, when the phonograph needle dropped again, and a tune unlike any other rose into the twilight. For many of the German women inside the camp, the war had not ended with gunfire. It had ended with silence. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, but they had served a regime that had demanded total obedience. Now, stripped of uniforms and purpose, they found themselves existing between two worlds. No longer enemies, not yet free. In those first weeks, the hardest part was not hunger or captivity. It was the stillness. No orders, no propaganda, no radios blaring the voice of the Führer, only wind and distant footsteps. Some women spent hours staring through the wire, watching American soldiers move casually without fear or salute. Others whispered questions they had never dared to ask before. What had it all been for? They saw kindness but didn't yet trust it. They saw laughter but couldn't share it. Years of indoctrination had taught them to distrust emotion, to see mercy as weakness, and yet every passing day chipped away at that armor. When a guard offered an extra piece of bread or simply nodded in greeting, it created ripples in minds trained to see the world in black and white. The human heart, once muted by ideology, began to wake again. It was a quiet rebellion, one that required no speeches or victories. For the Americans, jazz was just music, something to fill the long evenings far from home. For the German prisoners, it was an earthquake. Under Nazi rule, jazz had been outlawed as a symbol of racial impurity and Western corruption. Instruments like saxophones were banned from public orchestras. Even the syncopated rhythm itself was labeled un-German. Yet, for the young generation that had grown up in cities like Berlin and Hamburg, the sound had never fully died. Some remembered hearing faint jazz melodies from illegal radio broadcasts before the Gestapo shut them down. Now, in captivity, the music returned, but it came from the other side of the wire. At first, it sounded chaotic, almost defiant. The trumpet notes climbed and fell in unpredictable patterns, refusing the strict order they had been raised to obey. There were no uniforms in those notes, no marches, no hierarchy, just rhythm and freedom intertwined. It felt like standing in sunlight after years underground. Some turned away, unwilling to face it. Others listened, transfixed. The forbidden music spoke of a life beyond fear, a world where art was not dictated by politics, where creativity itself was a form of courage. That evening, when "Take the A Train" played through a soldier's phonograph, laughter erupted among the Americans, who clapped along and danced in the dirt. On the other side, through the wire, the German women stood motionless. One of them, a nurse named Anna, was seen biting her lip as tears formed. "We were not supposed to feel joy," she later wrote, "but I could not help it. It was the first time since the war began that something felt alive. Music had done what politics never could. It had crossed the fence. For those prisoners, listening to jazz wasn't just cultural shock. It was an emotional reckoning. Every note reminded them of what they had been denied and what they had been told to destroy. They had served a system that silenced difference, that crushed freedom in the name of order. And now, in defeat, the very essence of that forbidden freedom played above them, not as mockery, but as invitation. Psychologists who later studied post-war German POWs noted a peculiar transformation, a kind of reverse indoctrination. Instead of being forced to believe in new ideas, they were exposed to them naturally through daily contact. Freedom was not taught, it was observed. The sound of jazz worked like a mirror. It reflected a world they had never truly known. Spontaneous, mixed, improvisational, human. It was the antithesis of everything Nazi Germany had stood for. Some felt deep guilt as they listened. Others felt awakening. It was not just about the music. It was about identity. Who were they now, when the beliefs they had lived by had dissolved? A few of the women began to write short reflections in scraps of paper or on the backs of ration slips. One wrote, "They told us Americans had no soul, but I think I heard it in their music." Another wrote, "The rhythm frightened me, because it felt like freedom, and I didn't know what to do with that." In that moment, jazz became more than entertainment. It was a psychological turning point, a sound that dismantled walls without touching them. That first evening ended with silence again. The soldiers put away their records and the camp fell dark. But something had changed. The women didn't sleep easily. The rhythm lingered in their minds like a heartbeat they couldn't forget. The next day, they watched the Americans differently, not as conquerors, but as people living in a kind of emotional landscape they had never visited. For some, the realization was painful. For others, it was liberating. In the ruins of war, the human spirit was rediscovering what it meant to feel, and music had become its voice. To the American soldiers stationed at the camp, the war was finished, but its weight remained. Many of them had fought through the Ardennes, crossed the Rhine, and seen friends fall in fields that seemed to stretch forever. Now they were guards, caretakers of an army that had once sworn to destroy them. Their orders were clear: treat the prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. No cruelty, no vengeance. Yet for young men who had spent years in constant danger, the adjustment was not simple. Some still carried the bitterness of seeing Allied towns bombed, of finding concentration camps only weeks earlier. Others simply wanted to go home. Yet gradually something shifted. The sight of frightened women, most barely 20 years old, softened the instinct to see them as enemies. They weren't fanatics now. They were just people, stranded in the wreckage of ideology. So the guards began to act like human beings again. They shared cigarettes through the fence, offered coffee from tin mugs, even traded words in broken German. "Guten Morgen," one might say, followed by a hesitant smile. One evening, a soldier named Corporal Lewis pulled out his small phonograph. It was an old army model, dented and faded, but it worked. He placed the needle and the music rose into the still night air. It wasn't an act of defiance or arrogance. It was survival. Music had become their way to remember what they were fighting for. They played jazz not to taunt the prisoners, but to feel alive again after so much death. The rhythm carried laughter, nostalgia, and something else: forgiveness without words. In that moment, both sides stopped being enemies. They were simply people who missed home. Behind every camp's order was a principle that separated the American POW system from the chaos of the war's end: discipline through decency. By 1945, the U.S. military had learned that treating prisoners well was not just moral. It was strategic. Humane treatment encouraged cooperation, prevented rebellion, and built credibility among the civilian population. Commanders issued clear instructions. German prisoners, male or female, were to receive food, shelter, and medical care equivalent to American troops when possible. The aim was not compassion for its own sake, but stability. Yet in practice, this policy had a profound effect. Where the Soviets relied on fear, the Americans relied on structure. Guards were told not to fraternize, but small acts of humanity were rarely punished. The officers knew the value of morale, both for the prisoners and the men guarding them. It was also part of a broader American belief that democracy could be demonstrated, not just preached. The camps became silent classrooms of civilization, showing what a free society looked like in action, even toward its enemies. When music drifted through the wire, it was an extension of that philosophy. The prisoners saw laughter and creativity as things allowed, not feared. They learned that authority did not always mean cruelty. In one camp report, a U.S. lieutenant noted, "They watch us constantly. They expect punishment but receive order. They expect hatred but receive procedure. It is confusing to them, and in that confusion they begin to think." Compassion during war is a strange thing. It defies logic, resists strategy, and yet in moments like these, it redefines victory itself. When the American soldiers played jazz, they were not thinking of moral symbolism. But for the women behind the fence, that sound was moral revelation. It showed that the victors were not seeking revenge, but reconciliation. It forced them to confront the propaganda that had filled their lives. The idea that Americans were brutes without culture or soul. Now they saw those same men tapping their boots to the rhythm of Black American musicians, artists who would never have been allowed to perform freely in Hitler's world. It was more than music. It was an entire worldview expressed in sound, a world where difference was not a crime, and where life could exist beyond hierarchy and hate. Historians would later call this soft power, the ability of culture to change hearts without firing a shot. But in 1945, no one had that term. They only had a feeling that something human had survived the ruins. In those days, moral victory was not in flags or parades. It was in the simple refusal to hate back. The Americans had the power to humiliate, but they didn't. They chose order over cruelty, music over silence. That was their quiet triumph. And for the German women, it was their first glimpse of a truth buried beneath years of fear. Mercy could be stronger than force. As May faded into June, the routine of the camp continued. But something invisible had changed. There was more eye contact now, more cautious words exchanged across the wire. A few women began to hum softly after lights out, not in defiance, but in memory. What had begun as a melody from a foreign land was becoming a bridge between enemies. And one summer evening, that bridge would reach its most powerful moment, when jazz would rise again, not as background noise, but as the heartbeat of reconciliation. It was late June 1945, weeks after Germany's surrender. The nights had grown warmer, the air filled with the smell of damp grass and distant fires from nearby villages still clearing the debris of war. The camp near Rheims was quiet, its floodlights glowing like pale suns behind the fences. Inside, German women sat in the dim barracks, writing in notebooks, mending uniforms, or simply staring into the darkness beyond the wire. Then, faintly at first, came a sound. A few of the women looked up. Someone on the American side had started the phonograph again, that old, dented machine that seemed to hold half the spirit of their captors. The needle touched down, static crackled through the night, and then came the unmistakable swell of a trumpet. It wasn't a march or a hymn. It was Duke Ellington. The rhythm built slowly, lazy and confident, until a saxophone joined, bending notes in a way that defied the rigid music they had grown up with. The melody floated across the wire, carried by the summer wind, soft and liquid. The women listened in silence. Some frowned, uneasy, remembering the words that had once described this as enemy music, corrupting, dangerous, yet something in it felt alive, unashamedly alive. It didn't demand attention. It invited it. One woman, Elsa, a former nurse from Cologne, closed her eyes. She hadn't heard jazz since before the war. Her brother used to play clarinet in a student band before being sent to the Eastern Front. He never came back. She used to tease him for loving that American chaos. Now that same chaos brought him back to her for the first time in years. Outside the barracks, a few women gathered by the fence. The guards didn't stop them. Some of the soldiers off duty stood nearby smoking, their faces barely visible in the light of a single lantern. No one spoke. The music was enough. Then, one of the guards, a tall man from Louisiana named Corporal Lewis, called out across the yard, his accent thick and warm. "Y'all ever heard this before?" There was no answer, just the faint sound of shuffling feet. A woman finally replied in broken English. "In Germany, forbidden." Lewis laughed softly, not mocking, just surprised. "Forbidden? "This? Man, this is freedom." He said it simply, almost offhand, but the words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Freedom. The one word they had been taught to fear and misunderstand. The trumpet soared again, and suddenly, as if on instinct, Lewis began tapping his boot, snapping his fingers. Another guard joined him, then another. Within moments, the Americans were clapping softly, letting the rhythm move through them. On the other side of the fence, the German women just stared. Then one, a young girl no older than 19, began to hum along almost inaudibly. Another followed. Soon, a handful were moving gently to the rhythm. Not dancing, not daring to, but swaying ever so slightly, as if their bodies had remembered something their minds had long forgotten. Tears began to form, quiet, restrained, but unmistakable. For years they had been told that emotions were weakness, that discipline was strength. But that night, they learned the opposite. In the shadows of defeat, surrounded by barbed wire, they felt what victory of another kind looked like. Not military victory, but moral and spiritual awakening. It was as though the music itself was reaching across history, breaking down what war had built. The trumpets, the drums, the laughter from the American side. All of it spoke the same message. Life continues. As the song faded, the air seemed to hold its breath. No one wanted it to end. And then came the faint crackle of the next record, followed by a new tune. Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade. The mood shifted. The melody was slower, gentler, filled with melancholy and tenderness. Some of the women wept openly now. One covered her face with her hands, shoulders trembling. Another whispered, "It's beautiful, so beautiful." The guards said nothing. Some turned away, perhaps to hide their own emotion. Others stood quietly, heads bowed, listening. It was a strange communion, enemies united by sound. No speeches were made that night, no promises or apologies exchanged. Yet something irreversible happened in those few minutes. The fences still stood, but the hatred that had once filled the air began to dissolve, note by note. Later, in diaries and interviews years after the war, several of those women would remember that evening. One wrote, "We had been taught that Americans were monsters, but that night they gave us music instead of punishment. I cried because I realized how wrong we had been." Another wrote, "For the first time, I didn't feel like a prisoner. I felt human again." That night's quiet miracle would ripple beyond the camp's boundaries, because in the days that followed, music became more frequent, the atmosphere less tense, the silence less heavy. But one night in particular, when the music returned stronger, louder, freer, would mark the true turning point. The night after Moonlight Serenade, the camp felt different. Something unseen had shifted in the air, a quiet recognition that music had done what speeches never could. The guards noticed it too. The tension that once thickened every interaction seemed to dissolve, replaced by cautious, almost curious silence. 2 days later, another record spun on the phonograph. This time it was louder, more confident. The soldiers had propped up a small speaker against the mess tent, letting the sound travel freely across the field. Someone had found a radio and patched it into the system. The opening notes burst out. Benny Goodman's "Sing, Sing, Sing." Drums thundered, brass roared, and the rhythm rolled through the camp like electricity. This wasn't background music anymore. It was joy, unashamed, unstructured, and wild. The American soldiers clapped along, stamping their boots in time. One of them pulled out a harmonica. Another began to whistle. Within minutes, a few were dancing on the dirt, laughing, spinning, shaking the exhaustion of war out of their bodies. Across the fence, dozens of German women watched, motionless at first. Then something unexpected happened. One of them laughed, a sharp, nervous sound that startled even her. She covered her mouth, embarrassed, but the laughter spread. Others began to smile, hesitantly at first, as if rediscovering what it felt like to move the muscles of joy. It was contagious. The rhythm crossed the wire, not with permission, but with invitation. Soon, a few of the younger women, girls who had once worked as signal operators or clerks, began to mimic the rhythm, tapping their boots against the ground. Others clapped softly in time, uncertain whether it was allowed. The guards didn't stop them. In fact, one of them, a red-haired private named John Miller, walked to the fence and grinned. "Come on," he said, gesturing toward them. "You know the beat." They didn't understand all his words, but the meaning was clear. For a moment, hesitation hung like mist. Then one woman lifted her hand slightly, snapping her fingers offbeat but smiling anyway. The Americans cheered. The laughter that followed was unlike anything the camp had heard. Spontaneous, shared, human. From then on, it was no longer their music, or our music. It was simply music. As the song surged toward its climax, trumpets blaring like sunlight breaking through clouds, the entire camp seemed to vibrate with life. The guards danced without rank or uniform, and the prisoners, separated by barbed wire, swayed as though the fences were gone. It was chaos, but beautiful chaos, the very kind the Reich had feared most. When the record ended, a deep silence followed, not empty but full of what had been released, what had been forgiven. For the first time since captivity began, laughter echoed on both sides of the wire at once. That night, a sergeant wrote in his journal, "They cried, and we laughed. Then they laughed, and we didn't know what to feel." Maybe this is what winning truly means. Not their defeat, but their awakening. The next morning, something remarkable occurred. As the guards conducted roll call, one of the prisoners stepped forward. A young woman named Lieselotte Bauer, who had been a secretary in the Luftwaffe command. She asked in hesitant English if the soldiers would play that music again. Her courage broke the spell of fear. Soon others joined her, asking shyly for the same. They didn't know the titles, only the feeling. "Play the freedom song," one said. The Americans obliged. That evening, they played Count Basie's 1 o'clock jump. The rhythm was faster this time, the atmosphere brighter. But what began as another casual listening session transformed into something almost sacred. A few prisoners clapped openly now, some even laughing without shame. The guards, surprised but pleased, encouraged them. One German woman, once proud and unyielding, was seen standing apart, trembling, not from fear but from release. Tears streaked her face as she whispered, "So this is what we were afraid of?" Jazz had done something no weapon or speech ever could. It had restored humanity to both sides. The Americans, too, felt the weight of what was happening. These weren't just prisoners anymore. They were people caught in the same tide of history, trying to find a melody that made sense of it all. Later that night, after lights out, faint humming could be heard from the barracks. Fragments of rhythm, imperfect but sincere. The women were replaying the tunes from memory, their voices blending into the quiet. No one stopped them. In that fragile harmony, the war truly ended. Not with an armistice or surrender document, but with empathy reborn in the form of sound. Years later, one American veteran would recall that night in an interview. "I'd seen bridges blown up, cities burning, men dying. But I think the real victory came when I saw a German prisoner smile while listening to Duke Ellington. That's when I knew the war was finally over. And for those women, that smile, born of tears and disbelief, became the moment they stopped being prisoners of war and started being human again." By the summer of 1945, the American-run prisoner camps across France and Germany had settled into an uneasy rhythm of survival. The war was over, but peace was still learning how to breathe. Within the fences there was food, order, and safety. Three things that much of Europe no longer had. The women in the Rheims camp began to adapt to this strange new existence. The fear that had once filled every hour began to fade, replaced by quiet routine. They cleaned barracks, cooked, laundered, and kept records. Tasks familiar from their service days, but now done without the shadow of command. Some began to decorate their living quarters with scraps of paper or flowers collected from the field. A few even smiled again. Music continued to echo across the camp. It was no longer just jazz. Sometimes it was swing, sometimes slow ballads from American radio stations. The guards, realizing the effect it had, played it deliberately now, not as entertainment, but as therapy. It gave rhythm to days that otherwise might have turned into despair. What had begun as a single night of accidental communion turned into a pattern. Every few evenings, as the sun sank beyond the wire, the gramophone's thin metal voice would rise again, carrying Ellington, Goodman, or Basie into the air. The women would gather by the fence, not out of defiance, but because something inside them had changed. They were no longer listening as captives, but as witnesses to a world they had been taught to hate. For many, the experience became deeply personal. Some began to write diaries or letters describing the camp not as a place of punishment, but as a strange sanctuary from the chaos beyond. One entry found decades later in a German archive read, "We were prisoners, but they treated us like people." The music reminded us of something we had forgotten, that freedom is not only outside the fences, it is also in the soul. The Americans noticed it too. Morale among the guards improved. The endless days of supervision and monotony were lightened by a sense of quiet purpose. They had fought a war to end tyranny, and here, in a small way, they were living the proof of that victory. Letters home from soldiers describe scenes their families could hardly believe. One wrote, "The prisoners here aren't what we were told. They're just girls, scared and tired. We play them music, and they cry. I think it helps them heal. And us too." Some officers worried about the growing familiarity between captors and captives, but higher command often turned a blind eye. By the book, the camps had to maintain strict separation. In reality, compassion leaked through every crack in the rulebook. The Red Cross, visiting in late July, noted the surprising atmosphere. Their report read, "The female German prisoners appear calm, cooperative, and surprisingly healthy. They express gratitude toward the guards. The camp maintains discipline without hostility, an unusual achievement in post-war Europe." Outside the fences, Germany was starving. Millions were displaced, homes destroyed, families scattered. News filtered into the camps slowly, in fragments. Ruined cities, Soviet zones tightening control, hunger in the streets of Hamburg and Munich. Against that backdrop, the camp began to feel paradoxically safe. The irony was not lost on the women. Captivity under Americans offered more dignity than freedom under what remained of their own homeland. Still, guilt lingered like a shadow. The more they saw of American openness, the laughter, the generosity, the music, the harder it became to justify what they had once believed. Some avoided conversation altogether, unable to face that realization. Others sought understanding, asking guards about their lives, their families, even their thoughts on the war. The answers were simple but profound. We just wanted it to stop. The jazz nights became the camp's quiet tradition. Unrecorded, unofficial, but remembered. For some, it was the only part of their imprisonment they later spoke of with warmth. It wasn't the music itself, but what it represented. A door opening after years in a locked room. When the first repatriation orders came in late summer, the women were torn. They longed for home, yet feared what they would find. The camp, once a symbol of defeat, had become a strange island of humanity in a broken continent. By autumn 1945, the world outside the camps was beginning to reshape itself, but the wounds of war were far from healed. Germany was divided among the victors, its cities hollowed by bombings, its people searching for food, shelter, and a sense of identity. For the prisoners in the Rheims camp, release came not as a moment of triumph, but of uncertainty. When the first orders for repatriation arrived, many of the women packed their meager belongings in silence. The barbed wire that had once symbolized captivity now felt, strangely, like protection. They had lived for months under structure, safety, and even small kindness, a fragile peace in the aftermath of destruction. Beyond those fences lay a homeland they no longer recognized. The Americans processed them in groups, returning them to the French authorities, who then coordinated transport into Germany. Before departure, some of the guards shook hands with the women, exchanging brief goodbyes in broken phrases. "Good luck," one said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "No more war." The women nodded, some unable to meet his eyes. When the trucks rumbled out of the camp gates, the women looked back through the slats at the rows of tents and the guard towers fading behind them. From somewhere near the mess hall, faint music drifted again. A slow jazz tune, perhaps played for no reason other than habit. It was the last sound many of them heard from the American side. Their return to Germany was sobering. Towns were unrecognizable, streets filled with refugees, children scavenging for food. Families had been torn apart by bombings, displacements, and the chaos of defeat. The country that had once promised greatness now lay in moral and physical ruin. In post-war interviews, some of the women recalled that contrast with painful clarity. "We came back to nothing," one said. "No house, no husband, no faith. Only the sound of that music stayed with me." A few of them were ostracized, dismissed as collaborators or reminders of the old regime. Others quietly rebuilt their lives, marrying, working, raising families. But for those who had experienced that strange mercy inside the American camps, something within them had changed permanently. One former nurse, interviewed decades later, described the experience with quiet awe. "I realized the Americans didn't win because they had more weapons. They won because they didn't lose their souls." Her sentiment echoed in others. They spoke of music as the first bridge between victors and vanquished, the moment when humanity re-entered their lives. It became a symbol, carried privately for years, then shared in memoirs and oral histories once Germany began confronting its past. Historians later traced a subtle but powerful pattern among former POWs, especially those who had spent time in American camps. They returned home with different perspectives on democracy, equality, and freedom. For many, the seeds of post-war Germany's transformation, its rejection of extremism and embrace of open culture, were planted in places just like the Rheims camp, where jazz once played across barbed wire. In 1948, as Germany began rebuilding under Allied supervision, American jazz bands toured the ruins of cities like Frankfurt and Munich, performing in bombed-out theaters and repurposed halls. Crowds gathered, not out of curiosity alone, but out of longing. Among them were former POWs who recognized the songs. Some cried openly as the same rhythms that had once drifted through their prison fences now filled their free air. By then, the music carried a new meaning. It wasn't foreign anymore, it was universal. It spoke of survival, of change, of the fragile connection between enemies who had discovered they could be human together. In one 1953 radio interview, a German woman, once a prisoner at Rheims, summed it up in a single line that history would later quote again and again. "The first time I heard jazz, I felt shame. The second time, I felt hope. The third time, I felt free." Her words became a quiet epitaph for a generation that had lived through both tyranny and liberation. By the time the last of the camps were closed, the Americans had already moved on to new duties: rebuilding, occupying, policing. The prisoners had long returned home, carrying invisible memories. But somewhere in the records of that camp near Rheims, a note remains in an American officer's report. Prisoner morale improved significantly after exposure to music. No incidents reported. Recommend continuation of cultural contact where feasible. It was a bureaucratic line written without poetry, yet it described something extraordinary. Because in a war that destroyed cities and millions of lives, there had been a small moment when the victors didn't seek revenge, and the defeated rediscovered humanity. A moment when jazz, born from struggle and freedom, became the sound that ended silence. History remembers the great battles, the generals, the treaties, but sometimes the truest victories are quiet, carried not by armies, but by music. In the summer of 1945, behind barbed wire and beneath floodlights, something remarkable happened. The defeated and the victorious shared a moment without hatred. No flags, no speeches, no orders, just sound. A trumpet, a saxophone, a rhythm that refused to obey the rules of war. That night near Rheims did not change the outcome of history, but it revealed its soul. It showed that even after the greatest violence humanity had ever inflicted upon itself, compassion could still find a voice. Jazz, born from pain, oppression, and freedom, became the messenger of a truth larger than victory or defeat, that the human spirit, once awakened, cannot be conquered. For the German women who wept when they heard it, the music was not just entertainment. It was forgiveness made audible. For the American soldiers who played it, it was proof that mercy was stronger than vengeance. Between them, across wire and ruin, they built a bridge out of notes and silence. Years later, as Europe rebuilt itself from ashes, jazz would fill its air again, on radios, in cafes, in concert halls. To many, it became the soundtrack of recovery, the heartbeat of a continent learning to live without fear. And in that music lived a memory of a night when enemies stopped being enemies, and human beings remembered who they were. Because wars may end with signatures, but peace begins with moments like that, when one song, one act of grace, crosses a line no bullet could ever cross. The story of those women and their tears is not about defeat. It is about rediscovery. It reminds us that sometimes the sound of freedom is not the roar of victory, but the quiet rhythm of forgiveness drifting through the dark.